Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. You are standing before a wall of stone, not smooth marble, but crumbling, sun-baked bricks, pressed by hand nearly 4,300 years ago. There is a name written somewhere here in the angled, wedge-shaped strokes of cuneiform, but you wouldn't find it easily because history, especially the history of women, rarely survives in the open. And yet here, against all odds, a name endures. Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, high priestess of the moon god, Nana at your dot, and the first named author in all of human history. Yes, the very first person whose name we have attached to a body of literary work was a woman, and for a brief moment in ancient Mesopotamia. Her voice was not only allowed, was celebrated, but that moment would not last. Let's begin with what little we know. Enheduanna was born sometime around 2300 BCE, during the early days of the Akkadian Empire. Her father, Sargon, had risen from modest origins to become the ruler of a vast and newly unified Mesopotamia. But unification in this era was rarely about roads and markets. It was about temples and gods to rule the land. Sargon needed not just soldiers, but spiritual legitimacy. So he appointed his daughter Enheduanna as the high priestess of the moon god Nana in Ur, one of the most sacred and ancient cities of Sumer. She was not a figurehead. She was not merely symbolic. She was installed in the Agishashurgal, the great temple complex of Nana, and granted both religious and administrative authority. She became what historians call an Entu priestessa, lifelong role combining ritual duties, civic management, and often authorship. And right, she did. Enheduanna is credited with composing at least 42 temple hymns, known as the Sumerian Temple hymns, a unification of local gods under the political theology of the Akkadian state. She also composed deeply personal and poetic works, such as the Exaltation of Inanna, which reads like a cry from the heart of a woman, both divine and human. Here is one of her lines, translated: I, Enheduanna, the high priestess, I carried the basket of sacred songs. I chanted the joy of life, but now I am cast out. My beauty has turned to dust. She was exiled. Yes, that part is often overlooked. At some point, possibly during a political uprising in Enheduanna, was driven from her temple. Her poems speak of humiliation, danger, and a desperate plea for the goddess Inanna to restore her, and eventually, he was restored. Her prayers, political or divine, worked. She returned, and then, silence. Her name, once proudly signed at the end of hymns, disappears. Her literary style was copied for centuries, but her authorship was not preserved. Even the colophons, those short inscriptions at the end of each clay tablet, were eventually reattributed to anonymous scribes. Her authorship, slowly but surely, was erased. How does that happen? Not with fire, not with malice, but with neglect. In Mesopotamian tradition, copying a tablet was both a duty and a devotion. But as Sumerian gave way to Akkadian, and Akkadian later to Aramaic, the scribes copied less and less of the old poems. They kept the hymns, but dropped the name. Enheduanna became a structure, a voice without a face, until she was rediscovered thousands of years later. And even then, scholars disagreed. Could a woman really have written so many hymns? Wasn't it more likely that they were compiled later by male priests? Wasn't authorship too modern a concept? These questions were raised not in antiquity, but in the 20th century, when her works were uncovered in archaeological digs and published by Western scholars. They were met, not with awe, but with skepticism. her male successors were not doubted. Her name was, even now, some academic circles debate whether she really wrote those works. Despite overwhelming internal and external evidence, it is as if the idea of a woman writing theology, politics, and poetry was more difficult to believe than the works themselves. And that is where the erasure begins. Not in Ashdod, but in doubt. And so you return, now, to that crumbling wall of bricks. You imagine Enheduanna standing in her long, woolen robes in the central court of the temple, reciting her hymns to Inanna, goddess of war and love, protector of boundaries, breaker of rules. You imagine the pride, you imagine the control, and then you imagine it slipping, a revolt, a rival priest, an army that doesn't recognize the divine authority of a woman. And so she is cast out, her titles removed from the ledgers, her name scratched from the tablets, her words preserved, but her identity scattered like reed dust on river water. And yet, she survived because clay, despite all its fragility, endures, and one day, thousands of years later, in the British Museum and the tablets from Nippur and Yor, her name would be read again, Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon, priestess of the moon, poet of the first written voice. But the question lingers, why did her name have to be rediscovered? Why was the first woman to write in her own name removed from the literary canon of the ancient world? Who chose not to copy her name? And what other names were lost, not by violence, but by the quiet refusal to remember? If you walk through the ruins of your today, the temple complex of Nana is a flattened skeleton of what it once was. The ziggurat rises like a stubborn tooth from the sands, but the rest, the chambers, the storerooms, the private quarters are reduced to outlines and fragments. And yet, the ground still remembers, because beneath this sun-hardened earth, archaeologists uncovered the most remarkable relic of literary survival, a clay disc, just about the size of a dinner plate, baked, solid and impressed with a series of wedges and lines. It bore her name, Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon, high priestess of Nana. Not only was this among the oldest known uses of cuneiform to identify and author it, linked her not only to a divine post, but to political lineage. She was not a mythical figure. She was a person, and more than that, a bureaucrat, because priestesses, in Sumer and Akkad, weren't cloistered mystics. They were powerful civic administrators. The temple did not simply pray to the gods. It owned land, it employed workers, it maintained herds, distributed grain, paid taxes, tamed, and set the calendar. Enheduanna would have overseen all of that, and she did so at a time when royal women in Mesopotamia wielded direct influence, a practice that would shrink over the following centuries. We know she authored or commissioned a set of texts now called the Sumerian Temple Hymns, meant to unify the diverse and often conflicting pantheons of the city-states under Akkadian rule. Each hymn praises a different local deity, often tied to a specific temple. But the tone is not neutral. There is persuasion in these lines, atiks, masked in praise. The message is simple. Your God is powerful, yes, but serves a higher order, one that includes and transcends the old rivalries. This wasn't just theology, it was imperial diplomacy, and through it, Enheduanna positioned herself not only as a religious leader, but as a mediator between worlds, between Sumerian traditions and Akkadian politics, between old gods and rising kings. But even so, her survival was not guaranteed, not in ink, not in stone, only in clay. And clay can break the copies of her work we possess today. Come not from a single manuscript passed reverently through generations, but from hundreds of fragment shards found across Mesopotamia, from Yor to Nippur, from minor towns to major religious centers. Scribes had copied her hymns again and again over the centuries, long after her death. But slowly, her name began to vanish. One copy would leave out the attribution, another would misplace the order, a third would preserve the lines, but attribute them simply to the priestess. It was not destruction, it was attrition. There's something peculiarly modern about this kind of loss, not deliberate burning, not censorship, but a kind of organizational forgetting. Her works were useful, so they were copied, but her name was not essential to the function, so it was dropped, like a footnote trimmed for space. And this is where we must linger, because this is how most women are, erased from history, not with swords, but with omissions. And yet, the words remained in the exaltation of Inanna. Enheduanna tells us, in raw, invulnerable detail, how she was stripped of her robes, expelled from the temple, forced to wander like an outcast. She describes standing in the darkness, calling out to the goddess. My sweet mouth was silenced. Dust filled my throat. This was not only political exile, it was a literary silencing. And in that silence, she did something extraordinary. She wrote about it. She wrote not as a detached priestess, but as a human being suffering rejection. And that made her text personal. It gave us something rare, a first-person account from a woman in the Bronze Age, not filtered through myth or epic, but direct, emotional, and deliberate. She was not only asking Inanna for help, she was telling us, thousands of years later, this happened to me. So why did history let her disappear? There are theories. Some scholars argue that after the fall of the Akkadian Empire, the Sumerian priesthood reasserted its independence. Teed, and the memory of an Akkadian appointee, quote, was deliberately minimized. Others point to the gradual, patriarchal consolidation of religious roles. As temple economies became more entwined with royal courts, male scribes increasingly dominated the production and preservation of texts. The roles once open to elite women, like that of N2 priestess, became more ceremonial than obsolete. And the names of women slipped away one by one. But that's not the end of the story. In 1927, British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley was excavating the ancient city of Ur when his team uncovered a remarkable tomb. Among the artifact cylinder seals, carved vessels, and jewelry was that clay disc, naming Enheduanna. And in that moment, the first author in history returned, not in a blaze of rediscovery, but in a slow, meticulous process of translation and cross-referencing. It would take years for scholars to match the disc to the hymns scattered across museums and tablet collections, and even then, it wasn't celebrated. She wasn't included in most ancient literature anthologies. The field, dominated by men, often dismissed the idea that a royal woman could write with both spiritual insight and political nuance. But the texts told another story. The voice on the tablets was not passive. It was commanding. Here's another line from Exaltation of Inanna. You alone are magnificent. In heaven and on earth, you rise high. The fate of all lands lies in your hand. The subject is divine, but the speaker is not a scribe, not anonymous. She signs her name boldly at the end. The compiler of the tablet is Enheduanna, not scribe, not student, not anonymous. She owns her authorship in a way few men of her time dare to. And that's perhaps the most radical thing of all. In a world where most writing was transactional, trade records, grain accounts, temple inventories, she wrote with intention and about herself. She used poetry not to praise a patron, but to express pain, devotion, and spiritual crisis. It is the earliest surviving example of literary selfhood, and it came from a woman. Its memory was nearly lost. Now, ask yourself, how many? Others have vanished. How many priestesses, scribes, or queens wrote with their own voice and were never unearthed? How many lines of cuneiform crumble in forgotten storerooms, their authors anonymous because no one thought to include a name? Why did Enheduanna's name survive, if only in fragments? And what does it say about the fragility of legacy when even the first author in history had to be reassembled from clay dust? By the time the echoes of Enheduanna's voice reached us across millennia of mud, war, and empire, her world had already disappeared. The city of yore, once a bustling center of lunar worship and trade caravans, had faded into sand. The Akkadian Empire, which had stretched from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf, was gonna fractured by rebellion, drought, and time. The ziggurats crumbled. The scribes lost their schools. The languages changed. Somewhere in that great forgetting, the name of Enheduanna was buried, but not erased, because even as the cities fell, fragile, but paradoxically, eternal was more durable than paper, more faithful than memory, and through this medium, Enheduanna persisted. Her words lived on, inscribed in columns of tiny wedges, passed from scribe to scribe. Not out of reverence for her identity, but out of reverence for the power of her hymns. One might say she survived by accident, but perhaps it's more accurate to say she survived by function. The poems she wrote, devotional hymns, temple songs, political verse, continued to serve their purpose. In schools, in temples, scribes copied them as exercises. They didn't always know she wrote them. They didn't need to. The beauty and structure of the language is enough to justify the repetition. That's how many ancient voices endure, not as people, but as patterns. Yet, once you know to look, something remarkable happens. You begin to hear her again, in hymn, after hymn. You find phrases that no longer sound like collective liturgy, but like personal struggle. Enheduanna uttered this prayer for you, K. In ancient writing, the first person is a kind of miracle. Most authors spoke only through myth, or from the voices of gods or kings. But Enheduanna dared to say, I, not as a queen, not as a goddess, but as a woman standing before a divine force, seeking balance, mercy, and meaning. That act, simple as it may seem now, was revolutionary. She was not hiding behind narrative. She was documenting her own spiritual breakdown. Her removal from the temple was not just a political fall, but a psychological collapse. She describes darkness closing in, the loss of speech, her hair tangled with dust, and then, gradually, the rebuilding. She writes her way back to strength. By the end of the exaltation of Inanna, her tone shifts. Now, let your great heart restore me. Let me return to my sacred duties. And eventually, from the house in which I have been exiled, I have now been brought back. Some historians believe this poetic arc mirrors her real experience, cast out during a rebellion, and later reinstated as high priestess. If true, then her hymns are more than just praise. They are political documents. Pleas for reinstatement, wrapped in ritual language. They worked, but the world around her kept changing. After her death, the decline of Akkadian rule, the position of high priestess remained, at least in name, but it never again held the same combination of literary, spiritual, and political power. Successors were named, but few left records. Their tablets, if they wrote any, have not survived, and slowly the memory of Enheduanna faded. By the time Babylon rose, her hymns were still circulating, but often unattributed. Later, as the cuneiform script itself became obsolete, replaced by Aramaic alphabets, then Greek, much of a world fell into silence. The ziggurats became hills. The temples became ruins. The tablets became puzzles, scattered in museum drawers and archaeological reports. It wasn't until the 20th century that a proper translation of her work re-emerged. Scholars like Samuel Noah Kramer and later Betty DeShong Meter helped reconstruct her texts, tracing her name through dusty lexicons and neglected fragments. Meter, herself a Jungian analyst and poet, recognized the power in Enheduanna's voice, not just as a historical artifact, but as a deeply emotional and literary work. She wrote, in reading her, I feel I am listening to someone calling across a great chasm of time, not merely reciting ritual words, but speaking from a wound. In that wound draw, exposed, what ultimately transformed the remains one of the earliest literary accounts of female agency under threat. The question then becomes, what do we do with that voice? How do we honor a name that history almost forgot? One answer is to listen more carefully, because even now, fragments continue to emerge. Excavations in Nippur, Lagash, and Uruk have revealed new tablets, some duplicating known hymns, others with variations that suggest broader authorship or editorial influence. We may never know exactly how much of what we read as Enheduanna's work was truly her own composition, and how much was refined by scribes or shaped by oral tradition. But authorship, in ancient Mesopotamia, was fluid, and yet she claimed it. She signed her name. She told us who she was. In a culture where gods had thousands of names, and women were often reduced to titles, Kanna's act of naming herself was almost defiant, and therein lies her legacy. Not in the exact words on the tablets, but in the audacity of presence. She reminds us that women were there. They were not just wives or mothers or priestesses. They were creators, administrators, thinkers, and poets. Their names may have faded, but their fingerprints remain in the bricks of temples, in the grain ledgers, in the syntax of ancient languages, and sometimes in clay. So when you think about the first writer in history, don't imagine a bearded philosopher or a royal scribe in a linen robe. Imagine a woman standing barefoot on temple stones, her hair wrapped in cloth, her hand pressing a stylus into wet clay by oil lamp light. She writes, not to entertain, but to survive, not to tell a tale, but to anchor herself to time. And even now, thousands of years later, you are part of that survival, because you were listening. And in your listening, she breathes again. Let your eyes drift back, not just hundreds of years, but thousands, before Rome, before Greece, before even the towering pyramids of Giza had aged into the golden sand. There was Sippar. It wasn't the biggest city in ancient Mesopotamia. It didn't command the same grandeur as Babylon or Ur, but Sippar had something rare, something quieter. It had records, thousands upon thousands of records, pressed into clay, baked by fire, and filed in neat rows across generations. Contracts, leases, temple rosters, dowries, slave sales, loans, divorces, adoptions, court rulings. Sippar was a city of scribes, and among those scribes were women. The stereotype of Mesopotamian society, harsh, male-dominated, war-torn, isn't wrong. But it isn't complete either, because buried in Sippar's thick archaeological layers, wrapped in layers of ash and mud brick, were hundreds of tablets that told a different story. A story of female literacy, of legal agency, of ownership, and of an archive that nearly didn't survive long enough for us to know. Let's start, not with queens or priestesses, but with someone much more ordinary. Her name was Amat Mamo. She wasn't a noble or a warrior. She was a scribe, possibly a temple administrator, maybe an accountant. What made her exceptional wasn't the power she held, but that she held any at all, because Amat Mamo was literate, a Tar, and not only could she write, she wrote professionally. Her name appears on dozens of tablets recovered from Sippar, dated to the reign of King Amisaduqa of Babylon, around 1646 BCE. Many of them come from the temple complex of Shamash, the sun god. Others are administrative documents or contracts, legal records detailing land grants, storage lists, or personnel changes. She was not alone. At least 18 women scribes have been identified from Sippar in nearby towns. Their names are scattered, like starlight across the cuneiform record. Nidnatum, Kapira, and more. But Sippar didn't just let women write. It let them own, and sue, and borrow, and leave instructions for their own funerals. In the records, we find women leasing fields, collecting rent, lending silver, adopting heirs. Some of them even supervised slaves and apprentices. One woman, Nakia, sued her neighbor for encroaching on her property line. Another, Nin Labani, drafted a will naming her daughter as executor in act that required not just literacy, okay, but legal confidence. And here's where Sippar becomes something more than a city. It becomes a counter-argument, because when the archive was uncovered, it revealed not only the existence of women in law, but their integration into a system we often assumed was closed to them. These weren't ceremonial appearances. These were routine documents, everyday agreements, contracts etched in clay and sealed with cylinder stamps. And yet, that archive, vast and layered and dry, almost disappeared before we ever knew it existed. The site that gave up these tablets, Del Abu Habba, modern-day Sippar, was nearly lost to time. By the time archaeologists arrived in the 19th century, much of it had already been looted. Local villagers, hungry for fuel, had dug into the mound and burned tablets in their hearts, not knowing they were torching millennia of legal memory. Clay doesn't usually burn, but when it's unbaked, still soft from the earth that crumbles under flame, entire archives became smoke, and still enough survived. Enough to suggest that Sippar's female record keepers were not exceptional flukes, but part of a larger scribal culture that allowed, and perhaps even relied upon, women. Why Sippar, though? Why did this modest city in the northern reaches of Babylonian influence become a sanctuary for literate women? The answer may lie in its temple economy. The Temple of Shamash wasn't just a religious site, it was an economic powerhouse. It owned land, collected taxes, managed personnel, and distributed food. To function, it needed scribes, lots of them. And, unlike royal courts, temple institutions often pulled from a broader talent, pooling women from priestly families. Some of these women were Nadru, a class of religious women, often mistranslated as nuns, who lived in cloistered compounds but retained property rights. Others were temple workers who specialized in music, textiles, or administration. And while the role of women in temples varied by city and century, Sippar seems to have been unusually permissive. Or maybe it wasn't permissive at all. Maybe it was just pragmatic. A temple needs clerks. If your daughter is literate and your son is not, who do you send to the scriptorium? What makes this even more remarkable is the backdrop, because during the same centuries that women in Sippar were signing their names to contracts, other parts of Mesopotamia were tightening restrictions. In Assyrian law codes, women's rights were being limited. In some regions, veils were being mandated for wives and forbidden for prostitutes. The patriarchal clampdown had begun, and yet, in the dusty chambers of a sun temple, women were writing inventories. But even clay is not forever. As Babylon fell, as empires shifted, Sippar withered, the temple declined. The contracts stopped. In the tablets, thousands of them sank into the soil for over 3,000 years. They waited then. In the late 1800s, European archaeologists began hauling them out of the earth. Some were taken to the British Museum, others to Istanbul, a few to private collections, and slowly they were translated. Names began to reappear. Transactions, debts, DOWRIES, and in the corner of more than one document, Amat Mamu, scribe. Her name had not been erased, but the context had, because when those tablets were first published, the fact that women had written or signed them was seen as a curiosity, not a revelation. Early scholars often downplayed the implications. The word scribe was assumed to be male unless proven otherwise. Even when female names were obvious, they were labeled exceptions. Only in the late 20th and early 21st centuries did researchers began to ask deeper questions. Why were there so many female scribes in Sippar? Why do women disappear from later records? And why has our history failed to remember what these tablets preserved? These questions don't have neat answers, but they open the door to something far more compelling. Because once you admit that the Mesopotamian record includes women, not just in myth, but in contracts, you begin to see them everywhere, everywhere. The sharp edges of a broken tablet lie in the palm of a modern archaeologist, and as they turn it under the light, they don't just see a chunk of clay. They see a receipt, a loan, a widow's name. They see someone's entire legal existence, flattened into script so small and precise it takes magnification to decipher. Because Sippar wasn't a city built on marble or myth. It was a city built on accounts, and among those accounts were the lives of women preserved, however unceremoniously, in the silence of legal transactions. But what kind of life did these women really live? What did it mean for a woman to be literate in a world where most weren't? To own land in a time when property was wealth? To borrow and lend in silver, measured in shekels and minas, under the watchful eye of gods and witnesses? To answer that, you have to understand how temple economies worked in old Babylonian Mesopotamia. In Sippar, the great temple of Shamash wasn't merely a religious center. It was a lender, a landlord, a tax authority, and an employer. People didn't just pray there. They stored grain there, registered contracts, borrowed silver, leased out plows, and hired labor. It was, in every sense, a bank before banks existed. And temple archives, the ones filled with names like Amat Mamu and Nilabani, were the legal backbone of this system. Everything had to be written down, but not on paper. Paper hadn't been invented yet. They wrote on clay, soft, square tablets, the size of a hand, inscribed with wedges from a reed stylus, then baked hard or left to dry in the sun. The result? A document that could survive, and did survive, for 4,000 years. Let's open one. We read, on the 12th day of Tammuz, in the year after the king built the great canal, Amat Mamu, daughter of Iljuebni, Li Nds, 10 shekels of silver to Beletia. The loan shall be repaid within 3 months, with interest, stamped with her seal, signed with her name, legal, binding, enforceable. This was no act of charity. This was business, and that's where the story deepens. Because many of the contracts from Sippar suggest not only women writing, but women investing. They're not just borrowers, they're creditors. They're not just managing dowries, they're running agricultural leases. They're not just signing over servants, they're registering disputes about property boundaries, inheritance claims, and debt repayments. You began to see a network, not just of individual women, but of families where literacy and financial activity were shared between generations of women, mothers and daughters, aunts and nieces, widows and priestesses. And all of it, at least for a time, was legal and public. There's a reason so many tablets come from the temple precinct. That's where scribes trained. That's where archives lived. And that's where the legal status of a woman like Amat Mamu was preserved, not in myth or gossip, but in contracts. Still, it wasn't limitless freedom. These women operated in a narrow band of legitimacy. Many of them were Nadru, a special class of elite women devoted to a god, often Shamash in Sippar's case. They weren't wives. They lived in cloistered compounds, but they were permitted, even expected, to own property and engage. In finance, it was a strange compromise. These women were cut off from marriage and children, but given access to wealth and influence. Some scholars argue this was a way for patriarchal families to safeguard assets, put the wealth in the hands of a celibate daughter, so it wouldn't be lost to another clan through marriage. Others see it as something subtler, a form of economic independence, cloaked in religious obedience. Whatever the case, it gave us something rare, a paper trail of women's activity in the 17th century BCE. But then, it ended. Or, more precisely, it faded. By the time of the later Babylonian and Persian periods, women's names vanish from scribal rolls. Their presence in contracts becomes sparse. The temple economy continues, but the gender of its record keepers and litigants tilts decisively toward men. Why? Some blame the collapse of the Nadru system. Others point to the rise of more centralized bureaucracies with tighter control over scribal training. Some suggest a cultural hardening, a preference for male literacy, reinforced by legal and educational exclusions. But Sippa's archive doesn't just record the presence of women, it records their disappearance. That's what makes it so haunting. You're looking at a window, a brief one when women were visible in the mud and the contracts, and then the window closes, and for centuries afterward was forgotten until 1880. That's when Hormuzd Razam, an Assyrian archaeologist working under British supervision, began digging at a mound called Tel Abu Hapa, the ancient site of Sippar. What he uncovered would become one of the most important cuneiform archives ever found. Among the finds, over 50,000 clay tablets. Most were administrative, many were legal, and tucked inside, barely noticed at first, were the names of women, not mythical queens or legendary seductresses, just scribes, lenders, heirs, plaintiffs. The archive had waited for 3,000 years in silence. It had survived not because someone wanted to save women's history, but because clay, once hardened, refuses to rot, and because Sippar, forgotten by empire after empire, had simply been left alone. But not every part survived. Villagers, unaware of the tablet's importance, had dug into the mound for bricks and firewood. Many tablets were burned for fuel. Others were crushed, scattered, or sold. Some were taken by the Ottoman authorities. Others went to the British Museum, where they remain today, still being translated. We'll never know how many stories were lost, but what remains is enough. Enough to trace the rise and retreat of women's legal lives. Enough to ask, what would have happened if Sippar's model had spread? What if the temple economies had welcomed female scribes in Uruk, in Nineveh, in Babylon itself? What if the Nadru model had evolved, not collapsed? Would we have had female judges by the Iron Age? What literacy rates among women have risen? What inheritance laws have shifted? Can't know, but we do know this. In Sippar, for a brief stretch of dusty centuries, women wrote history in real time. They wrote contracts, they resolved disputes, they etched their names in clay. And because they did, you now know they existed. But that's only part of the puzzle, because the most quietly radical truth about Sippar is not just that women were literate, it's that for a moment, no one seemed shocked that they were clerks, they were owners, they were administrators of their own affairs. And then they were gone, vanished from the record, erased not by decree, but by neglect. So the question that lingers isn't, why did Sippar allow women to write? It's, why did everyone else stop? In the quiet shadows of a museum drawer, somewhere far from the dust and heat of ancient Sippar, lies a name, not carved into stone or etched in gold, but pressed into clay, just a name, on a tablet smaller than your palm, misshapen, slightly cracked, faintly inscribed .amat-mamu. It is not famous. It is not taught in classrooms or etched in history's great timelines. And yet, it is there, because unlike many ancient women whose lives passed without a trace, Amat Mamu did something different. She wrote things down, and because she wrote, and because clay doesn't decay, she remains. Her name is one among many in Sippar's sprawling temple archive, a collection of tens of thousands of legal tablets, receipts, loans, contracts, property sales, and temple appointments. Most are dull. That is their power, because boredom, served across millennia, means truth. The women of Sippar weren't legends or goddesses. They were scribes, creditors, claimants, widows, daughters, and plaintiffs. They didn't command armies. They lent grain. They didn't rule cities. They argued over boundaries. But it was recorded, and in Mesopotamia, that meant survival. Legal, social, and now historical. Yet, history isn't just what survives, it's also what's remembered. And the story of Cyprus women became one of the great silences of Mesopotamian history. Not because the evidence vanished, because the eyes that read the tablets looked past the names when scholars first unpacked the archives in the 19th and early 20th centuries. They were primarily looking for kings, wars, conquests, and deities. Names like Amat Mamu or Ninkala didn't spark curiosity. They were marked as scribal formulae or clerical roles, or unimportant. It took generations before historians began asking a different question. Not who ruled Mesopotamia, but who wrote it down. And the answer led straight to these women in the Old Babylonian period, around 1800 BCE. A window opened in Sippar. The temple of Shamash, the sun god, became not only a religious hub, but a vast economic machine. It managed land, collected debts, mediated disputes, employed workers, and housed scribes. And those scribes weren't always men. The Nadru, women set apart in service of Shamash, had unusual freedoms, though bound by vows of celibacy and barred from marriage. They were allowed to own property, lend silver, and receive inheritances. They lived in a cloistered part of the city, known as the Gego, or enclosure. It wasn't a convent in the modern sense. It was a space of constrained liberty, a paradoxical role that made these women both sacred and economically independent. And they left records meticulously. There are receipts for rent, contracts for fields, a ledger noting how many measures of barley were owed and to whom, disputes about boundaries, complaints about delayed repayments. One tablet reads simply, Year of the Canal of the King. Amatmam leases a date orchard to Enlil Zakir for 3 years. Payment in silver. Witnessed by 2 temple officials. It is not dramatic, it is not epic, and that is why it is powerful, because it proves something that is often doubted about the ancient world, that women participated in public economic life, not as anomalies, but as part of the ordinary fabric of society, at least for a time. But what happened to them? Why did their names vanish from contracts in later periods? Why did temple scribes, once occasionally female, become exclusively male? The answer isn't a single event. It's a slow cultural contraction. As Babylon's political power shifted from native kings to Kassite rulers, to Assyrian overlords, to Persian governors, the role of temples evolved. They became more bureaucratized, more centralized, more regulated. Scribal training, once local and varied, became standardized. Access to literacy, once passed through families or religious orders, became institutional and male-dominated by the Neo-Babylonian period c. 600 BCE. You can still find women in documents, but rarely as literate agents. More often, they are named in relation to men as daughters, wives, or widows, not as scribes, not as lenders, and rarely, if ever, as writers. It was a quiet erasure. No decree outlawed female literacy. No king banned women from temple roles. But across generations, access narrowed. And with it, so did history. By the time Greek writers described Mesopotamia, women appeared only in stories as lovers, temptresses, or tragic queens, not as clerks, not as plaintiffs, not as people who signed their names. That's why Sippar matters, because its archive survived just long enough to contradict the silence. And today, thanks to digital databases and decades of slow translation, more of these women's names are being traced. It's tablet by tablet, contract by contract. It's not an easy process. Each tablet must be carefully cleaned, examined, read often under infrared or using 3D scans. Many are broken or faded. Some sit in museum basements, mislabeled. Others were taken into private collections and may never be studied in the cuneiform script. It varies, even within SIPR's own archive. Scribes used shorthand, regional styles, or inconsistent sign placement. But slowly, they speak again. A fragment might read, Ninkala, daughter of Ilipata, swears before Shamash that the field boundary was changed without her consent. A complaint, a record, a line in the ledger of life. It may seem small, but it shouldn't, because in a world where most human memory is lost, where lives go unrecorded and unremembered, a woman's name, K, is not minor, it's monumental. It means someone had the right to speak, to sign, to argue, and SIPR tells us they did, even when others tried to forget, even when history moved on, even when future scribes wrote only of kings and gods. The archive was not burned. Not entirely. It wasn't erased. It was just buried and now unearthed. It leaves us with a final, uncomfortable thought. If SIPR could produce women like Amat Mamu, literate, legal, economic agents, and then forget them for 3,000 years, how many others were lost? How many cities left no archive? How many women's names never touched clay? How many histories are buried, not in fire, but in dust, in the spaces between stories, between records, between what was deemed worth writing down? You might never know. But now, at least, you know this. In a temple by the river Euphrates, beneath the slow sun of ancient SIPR, a woman once signed her name in history, quietly, stubbornly, remembered. Let your mind wander for a moment, not to the ziggurats of Babylon that rose above the plains in dusty magnificence, not to the thrones of kings or the banners of war, but to the corridor behind the temple courtyard. A narrow, sun-drenched hallway, packed with the quiet labor of women. You might hear the tapping of styluses into clay, the steady scuff of sandals on beaten earth, the faint murmurs of women reciting lists, prayers, contracts. Their garments rustle, linen dyed with pale mineral blues or left uncolored, modest as the roles they are beginning to lose. For you are walking into a moment, just before a change, and not a dramatic one, not a decree or a revolution or an invasion, but a slow, invisible shrinking, a narrowing of doorways, a tightening of permissions, and one that would erase women from the religious heart of Mesopotamia, not through fire or violence, but through administration. This is the story of how the female clergy of ancient Mesopotamia, women who once served gods, kept ledges, offered libations, recorded dreams, were gradually buried beneath a system of taxes, fees, and property constraints. And like most stories of historical loss, it didn't happen all at once. It began with boundaries. Centuries before Babylon rose to imperial power, city temples were the center of everything. They were where religion met administration, where crops were counted, workers hired, gods appeased, and debts paid. The priests and priestesses were both spiritual agents and bureaucrats, and for many generations, women held a place within that world. Some were Nadril, women dedicated to temple life, often from elite families. Others were Entum high priestesses with public roles in major cults. Still others served as musicians, singers, dream interpreters, brewers, and textile producers for the temple economy. But this access to spiritual and economic power had a cost. It existed only by the permission of a state that increasingly wanted steam back, and that something was revenue. As city-states expanded, so too did their need for organized taxation, a reliable stream of offerings, silver, and goods flowing into the temple and then redistributed through the bureaucracy. By the old Babylonian period, roughly 2000 to 1600 BCE, the temple was not just a religious space. it was a tax office, a grain bank, wage calculator. And in this world, the roles of women began to shift, not because they failed, rebelled, or disappeared, but because their independence became inconvenient. A woman who held land in the name of a deity might not pay tribute in the same way a tenant did. A priestess who lent silver under her own seal disrupted the lines of temple accounting. A clergywoman who died without a male heir might transfer property back to the gago, the temple compound, rather than the king's registry. All small things, not all bureaucratic issues, but bureaucracy has a way of slowly grinding down exceptions, so the records begin to change. At first, they reflect female scribes and witnesses. Then, over decades, their names appear less frequently. And by the time of the Kassite period, after 1600 BCE, many once common female religious titles had disappeared from the tablets entirely. Instead, we find taxes, levies on temple-owned lands, lists of barley quotas owed by tenant farmers, silver dues paid by households, a term that increasingly refers to male-headed units, and among these dusty lists, the names of women fade. What caused this shift? Historians suggest a quiet convergence of factors. First, the rise of more centralized kingship, with rulers now appointing male priests as representatives of royal authority. These men were often drawn from noble families and trained in administrative roles. They owed their status not to the temple, but to the court, and had little interest in maintaining the older, woman-inclusive structures of temple economy. Second, the institutionalization of the scribal schools, which largely excluded girls. Literacy became not just a skill, but a gatekeeping tool. And while early city temples had allowed literacy to pass through family lines, some scribes trained their daughters. Later periods treated it as a male professional monopoly. Third, the increasing codification of marriage and inheritance law. Its family structures solidified into patriarchal patterns. Women's public authority was framed more narrowly, tied to their role as wives, mothers, or widows, rather than as independent agents of religious life. The temple gagas, the female quarters, weren't closed by force. They were simply not refilled. Young women, once offered to the temple by elite fathers, were instead married off into alliances. To the priestess titles were left unassigned. The records no longer referenced the libations of female hands. The temples still sang, but the voices changed. You might wonder, did no one notice? Surely, some women tried to hold on to their rights, to claim land, to serve deities, to record dreams as they once had. And in some places, they did. There are fragments, rare but persistent, that suggest resistance. Women who brought legal claims against temple officials. Female musicians who appear in texts despite the manly structure of their courts. Widows who refused to surrender their property back to the temple, even when challenged. But the law was no longer on their side. A contract from the city of Uruk, dated to the 8th century BCE, records a woman attempting to reclaim her late mother's role as a temple weaver. The response: a fine, the appointment revoked. The reason: she has not been designated by the overseer. She has no male patron. That line tells you everything, because power, once shared, had become delegated, and the delegates were men. Even the gods seemed to shift. While earlier goddesses like Inanna and Ninhursag held immense symbolic and ritual power, later pantheons emphasized male deities. Marduk in Babylon, Ashur in Assyria. Their priests, likewise, were male, and as the deities hardened into male guardians of empire, the space for female clergy thinned. By the time of Persian rule, after 539 BCE, most temples were massive administrative engines. Their language of record-keeping was formalized into Aramaic and Greek. Their rituals continued: offerings, processions, hymns, but their female functionaries were gone. Not outlawed, just excluded. That's the quiet way erasure works it. doesn't always burn books. Sometimes it just stops writing names. And if you look at the temples now, those vast ruins of brick and dust, those looted walls and broken columns, you will not see evidence of the women who once walked there, unless you know what to look for. A clay seal impression with a woman's name, a contract bearing the title Nadru, a scribble in the margin of an inventory that reads, returned by daughter of the priest. They're not monuments, they're not grand, but they're real, and they ask a question, soft, persistent, unanswered. If a woman once served the gods, and no one writes her down, did she still serve? You already know the answer, but it's not enough to know it. It must be recorded again. One tablet. Time, somewhere beneath the collapsed layer of mud, brick, and soot. A pair of footprints once led from a weaving room to a storeroom. Bad. They were not monumental. They were not sacred. Just the oval dents in the ancient dust of a Mesopotamian temple, likely belonging to a woman with arms hardened by spindle and loom, calloused by labor, and still scented faintly of barley and copper oil. She might have been a weaver, or a priestess, or both, for in the temples of Sumer, then Akkad, then Babylon, such distinctions blurred. Work was devotion. Devotion was labor. To serve the gods was to stock the storerooms, write the receipts, light the lamps, and record the results. But by the first millennium BCE, she was gone, and in her place, a scribe with a stylus, a male overseer with a tablet, a bureaucrat with a rule book. The quiet, centuries-long removal of women from religious institutions in Mesopotamia did not look like exile or execution. It looked like organization, and, like most reorganizations, it began with a chart. Let us start in Uruk, once home to Inanna, goddess of war, sex, fertility, and contradictions. Her temples had long been tended by both men and women. The cult of Inanna, later syncretized into Ishtar, was known for its ecstatic rituals, its complex inheritance structures, and its female clergy. Women who lived in temple precincts often owned property and participated in legal contracts. In the early periods, these Nadru women were given land and rations in exchange for their lifelong service. They were not allowed to marry, but they could conduct business, adopt heirs, and own servants. Their records appear frequently in tablets, not just as participants, but as witnesses and seal holders. But by the Neo-Babylonian period, 7th to 6th centuries BCE, the frequency of these names declines. And where they do appear, the terms have changed. The once independent Nadru are now often tied to male administrators. Contracts begin to say things like temple fields leased by the authority of Bailier, overseer of offerings, rations distributed to female weavers by the priest of Marduk. The implication is subtle, but devastating. Women no longer signed. They were signed for the temple. Once a semi-autonomous space where female religious life could flourish, had become a structured hierarchy increasingly modeled on royal administration. With each new generation, a new layer of oversight was added. More record-keeping, more standardization, more rules, and with rules comes rigidity. Where once women could inherit land within temple estates, now inheritance laws defaulted to agnatic lines, meaning male line descent. Where once temple women were trusted with storage, weaving, brewing, and sacred music, now those roles were overseen by appointed male supervisors, sometimes called Rab Ekli, chief of the palace or compound. To an outsider, the temple still hummed with activity, but it was now the hum of managed labor, less like a sacred garden, more like a tax office humming under the weight of quotas. A single phrase tells you everything. The offerings must balance, and when balance becomes the goal, autonomy becomes the threat. Women who had once acted on behalf of deities were now folded into the accounting system as dependents, not participants. In the city of Sippar, once home to the sun god Shamash, and a powerful center of religious life, women had played important economic roles. Temple archives from Mesopotamia include dozens of tablets referencing women's contracts, land leases, labor agreements, food rations. These archives are extraordinary in their density and in their decline. From the Old Babylonian to the Neo-Babylonian period, the proportion of contracts involving female clergy drops. Some titles disappear altogether, and by the time of the Achaemenid Persian conquest, 539 BCE, temple bureaucracy had become streamlined, stripped of older roles, edited down to match Persian imperial norms. Persian rulers, like Darius and Xerxes, maintained temples, but they were less interested in the old Sumerian religious traditions. Instead, they saw temples as centers of regional governance. As such, their interests lay in taxes, not priestesses. And so, in the same way the administrative language shifted from Akkadian to Aramaic, so too did the structure of temple service. It became flatter, simpler, male. But there's more, because while economic reorganization played a major role, the intellectual landscape also shifted. Mesopotamian religion, at its height, was intensely performative. Festivals were loud. Offerings were theatrical. Sacred marriage rites were public rituals, blending fertility symbolism with dramatic recitation. These rites often required both male and female actors, priest and priestess, god and goddess, performer and counterpart. But by the first millennium BCE, a different model emerged, one rooted in written knowledge. Scribes became more important than singers. Texts overtook ceremonies. Prophecies were copied, indexed, and stored. This shift from ritual to record further disadvantaged women, because the scribal schools, known as Oedipa, were exclusively male by this point. The curriculum was vast: learning cuneiform, memorizing incantations, copying hymns, interpreting omens. It created a class of male experts who could interpret the divine without needing to act it out. Where once the gods were invoked through, by these, the women who danced, poured oil, spoke oracles. Now the gods were deciphered on tablets, and tablets, unlike bodies, required no gender. The divine was abstracted into code. And so, the woman who once stood beside a flame and read from a cup of oil was now gone, replaced by a man with a reed stylus and a chart of signs. You can still find her faintly in a hymn attributed to Enheduanna, the earliest named author in history. In a woman we read of Inanna's power. You thunder aloud, lady of battles. You walk in glory across the heavens. But by 600 BCE, those hymns were largely unread, filed, stored, referenced. The voice had faded. Only the quote remained. And this, perhaps more than any single law or policy, shows the depth of the erasure. For when power is embodied, it is vulnerable. But when power is encoded, it is exclusive. It lives behind doors, on shelves, in archives, guarded by gatekeepers. Gatekeepers who, in this world, were no longer women. At first, you might not notice what's missing in a museum display. There's a small clay tablet, labeled in clean serif font, Neo-Babylonian Administrative Record, Kie, 550 BCE. It is pale and cracked, covered in cuneiform impressions and inventory of temple grain distribution. To the casual eye, it's a document of numbers and names. To the archaeologist, it's a miracle of preservation. To the historian, tracing women's lives, it's something else entirely. It is a quiet disappearance. There are no female names on the tablet. No priestesses signing in receipt of grain. No women identified as property holders. Just lines of text listing men, suppliers, recorders, stewards, and overseers. The absence is tidy, clean, not loud enough to register as loss. And that is what makes it so powerful. Because in Mesopotamia, power was never just in temples or armies. It was in records, and records do not shout. So when women were removed from temple roles, they weren't erased by decree. They were simply written out of the next line, the next transaction, the next list of authorized seal bearers. No need for revolution, it's just a recalibration of paperwork. But that doesn't mean they weren't once central to understand their quiet removal. We must first sit with what their presence had meant. Women in early Mesopotamian temple life were not anomalies. They were foundational. From the earliest records at Uruk and Eridu, temples functioned as religious, economic, and social hubs, employing hundreds, feeding thousands, and channeling agricultural wealth through the hands of their administrators in many cities. Those administrators included women. Some were natural, dedicated women of the temple who could own property and make contracts. Others were into high priestesses, such as the famed Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad. These women were more than ceremonial figures. They managed land, oversaw ritual, issued orders, composed hymns. Their voices were part of the spiritual and bureaucratic fabric of Mesopotamian society. But something changed, and not all at once. The decline was slow, a century at a time. A new dynasty here, a rewritten law code there, a temple audit requiring consolidation, a shift in royal patronage, away from older gods and toward newer ones. With each change, little less space remained for female roles by the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian periods. Priestesses were still mentioned, but often in the past tense, or in ceremonial terms only. The powerful Nadru became more restricted. Their economic rights narrowed. Their legal autonomy diminished. We know this because the tablets tell us, not directly, but by implication. For example, where earlier tablets include both male and female witnesses, 2 contracts. Later ones include only men. Where earlier legal disputes involved women arguing over property boundaries or inheritance. Later disputes are mediated by male guardians or husbands, where earlier hymns invoked goddesses through female voices. Later, hymns are copied by male scribes in scribal schools. Even the architecture reflects this. Excavations of temple precincts from the early 2nd millennium BCE show multi-room complexes, with living quarters possibly for female temple staff. But by the 1st millennium, these features disappear. Temples become more rigid in layout, designed for efficiency, not community. A place once shared becomes singular. So what happened to the women? Some may have simply been displaced by administrative reforms, as temples came under tighter controls, especially during the reign of kings. Like Nabonidus or Darius, the roles previously held by women were handed to loyal male appointees. Others may have found themselves absorbed into domestic roles, married off to forge alliances, or funneled into less visible forms of labor. Some remained within temple precincts, but in menial roles, sweeping, weaving, preparing incense, still part of the temple, but not of its leadership, and some may have vanished from the record altogether, because the final blow to female priesthood was not necessarily persecution. It was disinterest. Once temple roles no longer needed women, once scribes, not singers, were the gatekeepers of the divine. One bothered to record their names, and when no one writes you down, disappear. This is why, for modern historians, the most difficult challenge in recovering Mesopotamian women's history is not opposition. It is emptiness. There are gaps where names should be, blank spaces where roles once existed, a kind of bureaucratic silence, built not from violence, but from indifference. Yet, despite this, traces remain in the long-forgotten archive of Sibir. Fragments of women's contracts were discovered, baked into walls, reused as fill-in later. Buildings. In these fragments, we see glimpses. A woman leasing land, adopting a daughter, receiving silver for temple services. In the hymns of Enheduanna, copied by generations of male scribes. Her name persists. I, Enheduanna, high priestess of Nana, exalt the Queen of Heaven. Her words remain carried forward, even after her office vanished, and in the legal codes, such as Hammurabi's, we find echoes of once vibrant roles, laws concerning dowry, temple service, and inheritance that no longer applied by the time the codes were etched into stone. These are the ghosts of a presence, not quite forgotten, but no longer invited. And if you listen to the rhythm of Mesopotamian bureaucracy, the measured repetition of grain, oil, wool, and beer, you can still hear a trace of female labor. The weaver, the brewer, the singer, the priestess, they are still there, just not named. So what does this teach us? Perhaps that disappearance isn't always about removal. Sometimes it's about revision. History, after all, is a series of edits. It's when those edits are made not by fire or sword, but by stylus and tablet. They are harder to reverse. A king can be remembered. A battle can be inscribed. But a woman, quietly, replaced by a man in a temple storeroom, that story is harder to find. And yet, that's where the story is. Not in the monuments, not in the myths, but in the dusty ledgers, okay? The forgotten courtyards, the contracts with missing names. That is the archaeology of absence. And in that absence, there is still something to learn. For even in their erasure, these women shaped a world. They spun its cloth, brewed its beer, lit its temple fires, and yes, signed its contracts, until they didn't. Which brings us back to the museum. Tablet, Neo-Babylonian, administrative, unremarkable, and yet once you know to look entire. Lives are missing from its lines, so the next time you walk past a museum display, pause for a moment. Not to read what's written, but to ask what isn't, and let the silence speak. You hold a small object in your palm, smooth, cylindrical, and covered in tiny engravings. It weighs almost nothing. But in ancient Mesopotamia, it carried the weight of a person's life. A cylinder seal, a person's identity carved in miniature. Pressed into clay, it served as a signature, a contract, a declaration of responsibility. Most seals from the old Babylonian period bear male names. But a closer look into earlier periods, particularly the Yor III era and portions of the Is and Larsa period, reveals something surprising. Among the seals buried in collapsed walls and cracked floors, quite a percentage belonged to women, and not only women, but women with titles. These were not just daughters or wives. Some were property owners. Others held administrative roles in temple and palace affairs. Their seals feature names like Nindada or Jamishtar, paired with roles: scribe, overseer, landholder. Their presence suggests something older than expectation, a world where women once held authority, even if limited within the flow of law. But as centuries passed, the legal framework began to contract, and with it, the space for women's names. What happened? This began not with a battle or a ruler, but with a shift in how documents were written in early Mesopotamian legal culture, especially around the time of the Ur III dynasty circa 2100-2000 BCE. Administrative systems were expanding rapidly. Temples and palaces were refining their ability to manage labor, land, and goods. Women, especially in temple precincts, often participated in these systems. Records from Amma, Gersu, and Nippur show women leasing fields, employing workers, and paying temple taxes. Their seals are affixed alongside male officials, not as appendages, but as signatories. But during the Old Babylonian period, particularly under Hammurabi, 1792 to 1750 BCE, legal codes began to centralize and codify behavior. Hammurabi's famous law code included detailed laws on inheritance, marriage, dowry, and women's rights. On the surface, these laws may seem protective, but they revealed something else: a growing need to manage women within increasingly rigid structures. For instance, if a woman's husband disappeared, she had to wait a set number of years before she could remarry. not out of mercy, but because the state needed to regulate lineage and property. In another law, if a woman entered a contract, she required male representation unless she was a Nadru, a temple woman exempted by vow. This shift marked a quiet but crucial turn. Women were no longer simply participants in law, but they were being repositioned as subjects of it. The legal assumption shifted from what does this woman do to how should this woman be managed. And with that, seals began to vanish. The decline wasn't sudden. For a time, Nadru women retained some privileges, often adopting other women, writing contracts, and leasing land. But by the time we reached the Kasai period, circa 1600 to 1155 BCE, their role has thinned. The bureaucratic landscape became increasingly male, both in record and in voice. Even when women appeared in legal cases, it was usually as dependents, being married off, inheriting through male kin, or petitioning for guardianship. Their seals were no longer used directly. Male relatives sealed on their behalf, or scribes used their names as references, but left them unlinked to authority. This shift shows up in the clay dot in Sippar. Earlier strata contained seals tied to temple women and contract making. But later, strata revealed a growing number of documents where women's names are mentioned without seals, just fleeting mentions in the third person by the first millennium BCE. Most legal documents involving women are declarations about them, not by them. So what does this tell us? That law in ancient Mesopotamia was never static. It was a living instrument, adjusting to royal policies, economic needs, and theological trends. And in that evolution, legal identity became increasingly tied to a public male presence. Women, who had once been able to speak through clay by sealing, signing, recording, were gradually reduced to footnotes in other people's contracts. And yet, this wasn't a uniform disappearance. Some cities resisted the trend. In Emar and Enheduanna, even as late as the second millennium, women continued to appear in property contracts. Some retained the right to manage estates, particularly widows and temple women. But these were exceptions, not norms, and often survived because of local customs or geographic isolation, which brings us to an unsettling realization. The erasure of women from Mesopotamian law was not a matter of eradicating them. It was a matter of standardizing who mattered. And as law became more professionalized, scribes, overwhelmingly male, began shaping the record with narrower eyes. The law was not just reflecting society, it was reshaping it. And so the seals stopped being carved. The names stopped being etched. The identities once rolled into wet clay, dried and crumbled, not because someone took them away, but because no one asked for them anymore. Let us begin with a simple impression, not of a face, but of a cylinder seal, rolled gently across damp clay. You can still see it today in museums in Istanbul and Berlin. The seal depicts a woman standing upright, offering a vessel to a seated male figure, perhaps a king or perhaps a god. She is not kneeling, she is not veiled. She is rendered with a steady hand, the lines confident and unmistakably proud. Her name, partially preserved, reads something like Jemaya, a servant of the goddess Awayedat. In modern terms, we might call her a temple administrator. But such a word flattens what she likely was. She owned land, she distributed grain, she signed documents, she gave orders, she received taxes. In other words, she mattered. The city was Umma. The period was the late the third dynasty around 2050 BCE, and in this sliver of Mesopotamian time, a woman's legal identity was not only possible, it was practical. But as we saw in section 1, this was not to last. The systems that once allowed Jemaya and her counterparts to leave traces legal, economic, spiritual, began to tighten. And the question we now follow is, how did these women lose the right to be visible in law? Without a war, without exile, and without anyone seemingly noticing. The answer begins with a quiet reorganization of bureaucratic logic. After the fall of the Ur III dynasty, Mesopotamia fragmented. Cities like Isin, Larsa, and Babylon jockeyed for dominance. In each of these places, kings began centralizing power not only militarily, but also administratively. They restructured land ownership, appointed male officials to temple positions once held by priestesses, and most significantly, they professionalized writing. Where once a household might record a field sale with a local scribe, sometimes even writing it themselves. Now, scribal schools emerged with standardized formats. They produced tablets that looked alike. They repeated the same legal formulas. A teen, most of all, keen, began favoring consistency over individual identity. This meant that rather than recording a woman's voice directly, scribes now wrote about her, and always in relation to a man. She was no longer Jemiah, overseer of wheat rations. She became Jemiah, wife of Ilambani, or worse, the wife. By the time Hammurabi scribes codified Babylonian law in the 18th century BCE, this pattern was well entrenched. A woman's legal existence was conditional. In the famous Code of Hammurabi, women are included, but always in managed categories. The daughter who receives a dowry, the wife who may be put away under conditions, the priestess who may not bear children, the widow who may remarry after time. Each of these identities is a legal type, not a person. They are slots in a system, not names on seals. And as this legal culture spread, the administrative vocabulary changed in earlier times. We find contracts with phrases like, Jemiah has leased the field to an Lalitan for one harvest term. But later contracts phrase it differently. An Lalitan has received the field. The field is the possession of Ilambani. Jemiah, his wife, is mentioned. She is no longer the subject of the verb. She is a clause, an afterthought in a legal formula. One might imagine this shift to be subtle, and it was. That's what made it effective. There was no proclamation declaring women unfit to sign contracts. There was no law banning their names from seals. What happened instead was a quiet redefinition of what counted as legal authority. Once the scribes, the palace, the temple, agreed that only male heads of households deserved direct reference, women's legal identities simply ceased to be recorded, even in cases where women played important roles, such as managing estates while husbands were away. The scribes often wrote the documents in the male's name retroactively. This is most clearly seen in the rare double contracts, where an early contract shows a woman making a decision, but a later one attributes the same act to her son or husband. It's as if the clay was rewritten without changing the text. This bureaucratic forgetting was not driven by ideology alone. It was also driven by efficiency. In a growing empire, record-keeping became a massive undertaking. Temples handled not just rituals, but trade. Palaces distributed grain, taxed lands, and conscripted labor. The scribes who managed this flow preferred consistency. Men were predictable. They had inheritance lines. They had titles. They were trained in the scribal schools. Women, especially widows or priestesses, were complicated. They didn't always marry. They adopted others. They held land without heirs. Their cases introduced exceptions, and exceptions made for bad administration. And so, they were minimized when possible. Scribes included a male proxy, but not. They omitted the woman entirely. This was not erasure in the modern sense. It was the slow sedimentation of preference. 1,000 tablets making the same decision in 1,000 small ways, and over generations. That became policy. Even the seals themselves began to reflect this change. In the Old Akkadian and Ur III periods, female seals often featured motifs of offering or weaving symbols of temple economy and domestic control. But by the late Babylonian period, women's seals were rare, and when found, they often bear no professional title, just names. Some even carry the name of the husband, not the woman herself. It's as if even the right to be engraved was loaned from someone else. But all was not entirely lost. In a few isolated cities like Sipper and Nipper, archaeologists have uncovered female names in unexpected places. Not on contracts or seals, but in school exercises. A tablet from a scribal house bears a practice sentence: Nedintu, daughter of Balami, weighed out silver. Why teach this sentence? Lest it once reflected a world in which Nidintu's weighing of silver was plausible, perhaps even common. These scraps do not undo the broader pattern, but they remind us that history, like law, is never fully settled. It ends with each person who dares to record what the system prefers to forget. When you run your eyes across a museum exhibit, row upon row of clay tablets under softly filtered lights, it's easy to forget that each was once held by someone, pressed, turned, incised, set aside to dry. Documents of contracts, inventories, and ledgers, not sacred scrolls or royal decrees. These were the files of everyday people, and in many cases, people were women. But as the centuries moved forward, the bureaucratic rhythms of Mesopotamia settled into hardened patterns. The women behind the tablets began to fade from view. The records did not shout their absence. They simply ceased to mention them by 1500 BCE. The traces of female legal actors became increasingly rare, especially in cities under tight central control. The scribes, who copied contracts, lease agreements, temple records, and tax lists, began referring almost exclusively to men. When women appeared, it was most often in formulaic roles, as daughters in dowry exchanges, as widows collecting pensions, or as unnamed wives in inheritance clauses. But how does a person or a group of people stop appearing in documents so central to daily life? The answer lies in how legal identity was defined earlier. Under the city-states of the Sumerian and Akkadian periods, legal identity could be extended broadly. A merchant woman might sign her own name on a contract. A priestess might lease temple land. A widow might transfer property to a niece or steward. The law recognized these actions not as exceptions, but as routine. Yet, by the Middle Babylonian period, legal identity had begun to narrow, and with it, access to official recognition. The legal system increasingly understood individuals in relational terms. You were not yourself. You were someone's something. And so, women became identified primarily as the wife, the daughter, the mother, or the widow of a man with legal status. In the eyes of the scribe, this was not erasure. It was context, but it functioned as a boundary. If a woman could not be defined in relation to a man, if she had no husband, no father, no adult son, then the scribes often left her out altogether. We see this especially clearly in land transfer documents. In early periods, women like the temple administrator Enheduanna could be directly named as givers or receivers of land. But in later periods, we find only mentions like the estate, formerly of the wife of X. Sometimes, even the name is omitted, just the woman. When ownership passed hands, it passed through men. Women were written around, never at the center. This change did not happen overnight, and it did not happen the same way in every city. Some cities clung longer to older traditions. In Emar, for instance, a city on the Euphrates, its tablets from around 1200 BCE still include women as participants in adoption contracts, even as Babylon had largely ceased doing so. Emar scribes recorded complex family arrangements where childless women adopted heirs and outlined inheritance terms. These tablets offer one of the last sustained glimpses of Mesopotamian women negotiating legal futures in their own names. But such exceptions soon vanished too. As Assyria rose and administrative unification took hold, the diversity of local customs was streamlined. The centralized models of legal authority, nearly always male, came dominant. The final stage of this process came not with dramatic laws, but with silence. By the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian periods, roughly 900 to 500 BCE, courts almost entirely exclude women from formal legal documents, except in set roles. Even priestesses, once central to temple economics, appear primarily as dependents. Their names survive in temple rosters, but rarely in ledgers or decisions at the same time. Seals, those small, carved cylinders once used to authorize a document, also changed. In earlier periods, female seals were common. In later periods, they become stylistically generic or disappear from archaeological contexts altogether. It is possible that many women stopped owning seals at all. In a sense, seal, the symbol of legal authorship, had been taken from their hands. One could argue that women still existed in law. They still married, bore children, inherited. In some cases, but they were no longer legal actors in their own right. Their roles were managed through others, their transactions recorded through intermediaries, their rights expressed by male kin. This change echoes in the archives themselves. In Nippur, scholars discovered hundreds of legal tablets buried beneath a collapsed house. These included deeds, loan records, and temple agreements spanning 2 centuries. Yet, among them, female names are exceedingly rare, and when present, they are largely passive. They receive food rations. They witness agreements made by others. Nowhere among them is a woman granting land, signing a lease, or initiating a lawsuit. Acts we know they performed in earlier centuries. The system had shifted. The scribes, trained in uniform schools, had narrowed the script. The bureaucracy had closed around its definitions, and women, once participants in the written logic of Mesopotamian cities, had been turned into objects of record-keeping rather than subjects of it. But this is not to say they were passive in the gaps. We glimpse resistance, quiet, persistent, and administrative. Some women continued to act through surrogates, younger sons, trusted servants, even business partners. Some religious communities shielded small enclaves of female scribes who kept records privately, perhaps informally. One such example appears in Uruk, where a group of women associated with the Temple of Ishtar appeared to have maintained internal temple logs, never submitted to the state archive, but used for internal tracking. And then there is the evidence of memory inscriptions and hymns, genres less bound by administrative form. Female names appear again. They are praised as wise, trusted, and keepers of order. They are remembered not just as daughters and wives, but as servants of the great goddess, managers of the storerooms, weighers of silver, and voices of justice. Perhaps the most haunting comes from a single line inscribed in the 7th century BCE on a broken stele. Let it be known, she judged well. No name, no date, no city, just a trace of a legal identity that the bureaucracy no longer recorded, but someone still remembered. This fragment suggests something crucial. While the official records grew narrower, the social memory of women's authority lingered. Oral traditions, family stories, temple rituals, these carried forward traces that the clay did not. And so the question lingers, was this erasure ever complete? Did the bureaucracy succeed in fully redefining the law without them? Or is it merely that we've been looking in the wrong archives? Perhaps, somewhere beneath layers of broken brick and dried mud, a cache of contracts still lies waiting. A bundle of tablets written by hands history forgot to silence. Set of names that once signed boldly and might still speak again, and maybe, just maybe, those tablets will not need to be translated to be understood, because their message will be clear. She was here, she was trusted, and she mattered. The ziggurat rose like a stairway to heaven, but heaven in Mesopotamia had many steps, from the mud bricks of Ur to the layered pyramids of Babylon. These massive structures dominated not just the skyline, but the spiritual map of a city. Temple at the top, often dedicated to a major deity like Inanna or Marduk. was not merely a place of prayer. It was the economic and administrative heart of a kingdom. And at the heart of that heart, hidden in plain sight, lived the daughters of the gods, the women bred, trained, and consecrated to serve in the shadow of the divine. They were not wives, and they were not mothers. They were Nadru and priestesses, Lukar and Ishtarich, each title denoting a different layer of duty, restriction, and privilege. Some never married. Some owned land. Some were expected to sing, to cook, to guard ritual silence. Others were forbidden to weep. They were cloistered, not out of shame, but because their presence was thought to radiate something too powerful to mix with ordinary life. And yet, for all their centrality in Mesopotamian religion and society, these women have largely vanished from the historical record. The irony is sharp. The priestesses of Mesopotamia left behind thousands of economic tablets, leases, donations, food inventories, temple rosters. They were visible. Ties, they signed their names. They managed estates and negotiated with officials. But centuries later, when historians tried to reconstruct the lives of these women, they found only fragments. A name here, a role there. And sometimes, not even that one such woman is known only. From a receipt, 2 shekels of silver, measured by the seal of Enheduanna, Nadru of Shamash, who was Enheduanna. No one knows. Her name does not appear in poetry, in law, or in any king's chronicle. Only in that transaction, a flicker of economic breath before silence closes in again. To understand what was lost, you must first understand what these temple women were. The most famous of them, Nadru, were often daughters of elite families, given to the temple not as punishment, but as elevation. In the city of Sippar, the god Shamash had a temple complex where Nadru women lived in their own quarter. They weren't secluded nuns. They owned property, employed servants, and even adopted children, since they were barred from biological motherhood. Their role was to serve the deity through devotion and administration, not through reproduction. Adoption became their legal tool for extending their lineage and managing inheritance. Many Nadru women adopted younger women, often relatives, who inherited their houses and temple roles. In a world where women outside of male kin networks had little legal standing, adoption offered a radical workaround, one that preserved female lineage through legal creativity. And yet, the tablets from later periods, this practice disappears. By the time Babylon rose to prominence under Hammurabi and his successors, adoption by women was no longer commonplace. Temple women were still mentioned, but mostly in passive roles, recipients of food rations or names on rosters. The intricate networks they had once created, families of spiritual daughters, property passed down from priestess to priestess, are no longer visible. Where did they go? Part of the answer lies in the changing relationship between temple and state. In earlier periods, temples operated with considerable independence. Priestesses managed their own resources. Kings might endow temples with land or laborers, but they rarely interfered with daily administration. But as royal power centralized, especially in Babylon and later Assyria, the temple became a tool of the state, and women within it became managed. Royal daughters were still appointed as high priestesses, but their roles became increasingly ceremonial. The Nadru system was phased out. Adoption by women was curtailed. Temple property was brought under palace control. The priestess, once a spiritual and economic actor, became a ceremonial figure, useful for diplomacy, but not for governance. In the economic tablets, this shift is painfully clear. In the early Old Babylonian period, we find hundreds of contracts initiated by Nadru women. They buy fields, they rent storehouses, they lend silver, sponsor construction. In the later periods, nothing. The seal impressions stop. The women's names vanish. The titles become formalities, not job descriptions. Even the vocabulary changes. The titles, Nadru and Lukar, fade from legal use. Instead, women associated with the temple are simply called daughter of the temple, a phrase that tells us nothing about their function, their rank, or their rights. It is the bureaucratic equivalent of calling a physician someone who works in a building, stripped of detail, stripped of dignity. And yet, the memory of these women survived, not in state archives, but in literature. In some hymns, priestesses are described as the eye of the god, she who watches the horizon and keeper of the night lamp. These are not metaphors. In temple life, a priestess might literally be tasked with staying awake to maintain sacred fires, interpret dreams, or time offerings with celestial movements. In a world without clocks, these were high responsibility roles, deeply technical, deeply spiritual. But hymns are not contracts. They are not dated. They do not provide names. And so, while poetry remembered the importance of priestesses, the law forgot. The final irony is that many priestesses likely helped write the very records that would later omit them. In the early scribal schools, women were not entirely excluded. Some trained to manage temple accounts or serve as literate administrators. Seals bearing feminine names attached to account tablets suggest active participation. But as literacy narrowed here into elite male domains, these women lost access to the very tools that once recorded their presence. The pen or stylus passed from their hands to others, and those others chose not to write them back in. In one rare surviving letter, a priestess writes to a temple official, "I have fulfilled the measure. The oil is rendered. My seal is affixed. Do not delay the grain." The tone is brisk, managerial, even impatient. It is not the voice of someone on the margins. It is the voice of a woman accustomed to being obeyed. But her name, lost. The tablet is broken at the top. All we have is her instruction, her expectation, competence, and her silence. You stand before the temple, again not the towering ziggurat now, but the smaller shrine beside it. A side hall made of baked brick and silence. Inside, the walls are smooth with time. Scent is not incense, not anymore. Dust and old oil, and the fading sweetness of 1,000 forgotten rituals. You might have walked past this door without noticing it, but once, this was a place of decisions, of inheritance, of whispers that echoed into law. This was where women ruled, not as queens, not as warriors, not as the faces on coins or the names in chronicles, but as spiritual custodians of lineage, property, and divine will. By the middle of the 2nd millennium BCE, priestesses like the Nadru and the Antu had, 4 generations, preserved a female tradition of temple residence, legal autonomy, and social influence. They were consecrated to gods like Shamash in Sippar, Marduk in Babylon, and especially Inanna, the goddess who was not merely divine, but female, fierce, and central. But change was coming, and it came not with war or fire, but with lists. It came with ledgers, with bureaucratic reforms, tax codes, and royal edicts. It came with the standardization of roles. The priestesses, who once negotiated land deals and lent out grain reserves, were increasingly assigned ceremonial functions, the rights to adopt heirs, to litigate in court, or to serve as temple scribes were gradually curtailed. What happened to these women, these powerful daughters of the ziggurat, was not sudden erasure. It was slow marginalization, quiet sidelining beneath layers of paperwork and shifting theology. At first, they adapted. We see this in Sippar. By the time the Nadru system reached its height, these women were not only managing temple properties, but leasing fields, hiring laborers, and even petitioning royal courts when contracts were violated. In one surviving tablet, a Nadru woman named Amanalu sues her brother for failing to deliver an agreed-upon share of rental income. She not only wins the case, she has the judgment recorded under her own seal, a rare mark of autonomy. But by the 17th century BCE, the pattern shifts. The contracts diminish in number. The language becomes impersonal. Names like Amanilu vanish, replaced by anonymous references to female temple workers or property of the shrine. The once detailed records of women's business transactions dissolve into collective entries, rations given to unnamed Nadru, debts owed by the daughters of the temple. It's as though the bureaucracy stopped seeing them as people and began seeing them as units. This transition was part of a broader reorganization of temple economies. Under Hammurabi and his successors, the centralization of power meant tighter control over temple lands and labor. Temple women, once self-sustaining through their estates and household economies, were increasingly treated as state dependents, and with dependency came restrictions. They could no longer freely adopt heirs. Their property became subject to royal oversight. Their contracts had to be consigned by male administrators. Even the language of ownership changed, where once a priestess might be described as mistress of her house. Later, tablets referred to their dwellings as residents of the Nadru enclosure, emphasizing institutional control over personal rights. The slow collapse of female autonomy was mirrored in religious narratives too. Earlier myths had elevated goddesses like Inanna and Nisaba, the goddess of writing, two central roles in creation, judgment, and wisdom. Later, hymns increasingly emphasized male deities, Marduk, Ashur, and Lil, as the ultimate sources of authority. Priestesses were still present, still dressed in the regalia of sacred duty, but their speech no longer shaped law. In the liturgies, they sang. In the court, they fell silent. And yet, not all signs of power disappeared. Archaeological discoveries from sites like Mari and Nippur revealed that women continued to participate in temple life in more subtle ways, not always as titled priestesses, but as scribes, healers, dream interpreters, and stewards. In one astonishing find, tablet from the Kassite period records a woman named Ilambani who served as guardian of the temple granaries, a position of both logistical and economic importance, though not referred to with traditional priestess titles. She held the seal and authority to oversee distribution, crucial role in managing seasonal famine. Another woman, Ninsidaru, appears in ritual lists as she who keeps the moon calendar, a job requiring precise astronomical knowledge and deep familiarity with both the heavens and the agricultural cycle. These glimpses suggest that as formal titles diminished, women found alternative niches. They stepped sideways into roles that lacked grandeur but retained impact. Their names weren't carved on palace walls, but their decisions fed cities, and still the record shrank. In late Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian archives, the vast administrative networks that once cataloged every bushel of barley and every robe stitched by temple. Women become curiously quiet about the female presence in temple life, where once a dozen Nadru names might populate a single record. Now we find nothing but male officials and scribes. The architecture remained, the cloisters, the side rooms, the storehouses, but the voices inside were lost. Why? Some historians suggest it was the increasing militarization of Mesopotamian society. As empires like Assyria and later Persia began to dominate the region, the religious landscape shifted to reflect imperial ideology, with priesthoods aligning more tightly with the needs of the court. Others point to internal reforms, the streamlining of temple operations, the decline of hereditary priesthoods, and the professionalization of scribal schools, now largely male, as factors that narrowed the pipeline through which women could maintain spiritual and administrative authority. There's also the quiet matter of historical preference. Later compilers of history, both in the ancient world and in modern times, simply found male deeds more relevant. The sieges, the decrees, the empire building, the woman who measured oil for the sacred lamp. She did not make it into the textbooks. Even the languages conspired against memory. Cuneiform, for all its complexity and richness, often leaves names unpronounced or titles ambiguous, especially in damaged tablets. The phrase, daughter of the temple, might refer to a Nadru, a looker, or simply a servant girl assigned to kitchen duty. Without contextual clues, the record becomes a blurred sketch. And then there's the final insult, the physical destruction. Many temple complexes that once housed these women were demolished, repurposed, or buried under later construction. When Babylon fell, it was not just a political capital that collapsed. It was a spiritual ecosystem. The residential quarters of temple women became rubble. Their archive rooms turned to dust. Today, the best hope of recovering their lives lies not in monuments, but in fragments. A broken tablet that lists a priestess's grain tax, a seal, oppression with a feminine name pressed into drying clay, a scribbled inventory of silver dishes kept by the woman of the night room. Each is a whisper. None speak loudly, and so, in the silence that followed the fall of temples, the daughters of the ziggurat, once central to the rhythm of Mesopotamian life, faded, not because they failed, but because no one bothered to remember them. They were erased, not by fire, but by neglect. You return now to the edge of the temple complex night, in ancient Babylon, not in your Orsipper, but in the halls of a museum. The tablets are behind glass, their cuneiform signs worn by time, their meaning uncovered only in fragments. Names, once spoken in ritual, now exist in catalog numbers and scholarly footnotes, but still they whisper. Some are no larger than a palm, a rectangle of mud hardened in the sun 4,000 years ago. Some bear seals, delicate patterns etched by ringed fingers. Others are barely legible, the script eaten by centuries of salt and silence. You might walk past them and never guess that these slivers of earth once bore witness to a vanished lineage of women whose authority stretched across centuries. Legacy wasn't an empire, but something quieter, more enduring. Contracts, calendars, property ledgers, prayer schedules. The machinery of daily survival, quietly held in women's hands. Nowhere is this clearer than in the thousands of recovered administrative tablets from the temple archives of Sippar, Nippur, and Uruk. Among them are documents of remarkable clarity: property sales, labor arrangements, adoption contracts executed by and for temple women. And in these documents, a pattern emerges. These women weren't ornamental priestesses, sealed away in cloisters. They were landlords, litigants, diplomats. They adopted children, sometimes male heirs, to manage their estates. They owned slaves and freed them. They loaned out silver, took repayment in grain, and charged interest. Some even donated land to the temple itself, carefully stipulating the conditions under which it could be used. Consider the case of a woman named Ubartam, Nadru, of the Shamash temple in Sippar, around 1750 BCE. Nearly 50 tablets record her transactions: loans made, property rented, contracts upheld. She appears in court, she negotiates terms, she asserts rights, and then nothing. Like most Nadru, she fades from the record, not because her life ended, but because the archives shifted. As later dynasties consolidated power, the bureaucratic record became less interested in individual agency, more concerned with quotas, grain yields, and imperial order. We still find references to temple women, but they are generic. They are listed as ration receivers, as textile workers, as unnamed bodies in rosters. A woman who once held a seal of her own was now folded into bulk entries: 30 garments delivered by the women's quarter, 14 minas of silver owed by temple women. Their identities eroded, not with violence, but with standardization. Even their titles became slippery. The Nadru were no longer described as votaries of Shamash. They became residents, then inhabitants. Finally, their houses were absorbed into the temple complex, entirely no longer private dwellings, but institutional spaces, and the language changed with them. In earlier periods, contracts frequently used terms like belty mistress to refer to these women. Later, such honorifics disappear. Daughter of the temple becomes an administrative label, not a spiritual role. In a modern record, we often confuse the two. K's scribbled name on a tablet could belong to a powerful estate holder or a kitchen maid. Without context, the line between priestess and servant blurs, and that blurring was part of the erasure. It wasn't just that the temples stopped recording these women as individuals. It was that they were folded into systems-less categories, inventories, until they were indistinguishable from the labor they performed. The quiet irony. That same bureaucracy preserved them. If a woman had not filed a contract, her name would not survive. She had not stamped the seal. We would not know she lived. If she had not fought in court for a disputed plot of land, her story would not be studied. Now, in doctoral dissertations and museum displays, their survival depends entirely on the dullest tools of record keeping. But for every woman, we know Ubartum, Amanulu, Ninceder, or hundreds more whose names are lost. We know they were there because the structure required them. Temples needed grain managers, scribes, weavers, calendar keepers. Someone had to count the loaves, measure the oil, write the prayers. They were there. They simply weren't considered worth naming. And so, when people ask today, where were the women of Mesopotamia? The answer is everywhere. In the fabric, in the silver weights, in the hours of the moon. They were never absent, just ignored. The bigger question is not where they went. It is who chose not to remember them. That choice wasn't made once. It was made 1,000 times in each decision not to renew a priestess's title, in each edict that narrowed the scope of female inheritance, in each chronicle that recorded kings and battles but skipped over the female administrators of the temples that made those kingdoms possible. It was made again in modern times, when early archaeologists prioritized statues of kings over household inventories, when translations omitted feminine forms of titles, when textbooks chose to highlight Hammurabi's laws, but not the women who interpreted them. And even now, the legacy of those choices continues, because many of the most well-preserved texts we have from ancient Mesopotamia, those that sit in the British Museum, in the Louvre, in Istanbul, were taken from temple sites, and most of those sites were male-dominated institutions. The archives of female-run temple residences were often left behind, looted or buried. Some tablets, like those from the Enheduanna temple in Uruk, mention female scribes and accountants, but others lie unread, untranslated, because they are fragmentary, or because the scholars trained to interpret them are working on more important materials. In a way, the question of erasure becomes circular. To see the women of Mesopotamia, we must know to look for them. But to know to look, we must have seen them once already. So what is left? Perhaps it is in the margins, the seal of a woman on a grain record, a careful phrasing of a contract that ensures an adopted daughter will inherit, the long list of weaving deliveries signed off not by a priest, but by a woman whose name is otherwise unknown. Or perhaps it is in the architecture itself. Some of the housing complexes attached to temples, scopate in places like Siparamnamum show remarkably private designs. Small kitchens, storage bins, courtyards arranged for light and solitude. These were not monastic cells. They were homes. Homes built for women who managed sacred duties while also tending small economies of care. No one builds a house without a plan, even if the name of the architect is lost. The blueprint endures, and that is perhaps the final gift of the temple. Women of Mesopotamia, they understood the power of systems, of recording, redundancy. They left behind not just prayers, but protocols, rituals, procedures, methods for marking the days and the hours. They built stability out of repetition. And so, even as the world around them shifted, kings came and fell, temples rose and crumbled, they endured a little longer. Not by resisting change, but by embedding themselves in its machinery, until One day, the machinery moved on without them, and they were gone. Not because they failed, but because someone decided their story didn't matter anymore. But now you are listening. You are listening.